everybody. Good afternoon. I am Ann Corfus. I am the Annual Giving Manager at Prevent Child Abuse North Carolina. And I am so excited to be joined today by one of our Five Factors Virtual 5K sponsors from DTE, Mark Cousineau, who is the president of DTE Biomass Energy, who is going to join us for our sponsor highlight and sharing a webinar on renewable energy. Thank you, Mark Cousineau, for joining us from Detroit. We so appreciate your sponsorship, your support, and this webinar.
Well, thank you, Ann, and thanks for the opportunity to conduct this webinar and talk with you guys today. This is our second year associated with Prevent Child Abuse North Carolina, and we're again proud to be a named sponsor for this year's five-factor virtual 5K event that you guys are conducting virtually. As Ann mentioned, I head up the team responsible for our company's biogas to renewable energy assets. We're doing a lot of cool things right now in the renewable energy space, and Ann thought it might be interesting if I share with you some of our recent activities, especially in the area of converting dairy cow manure into green renewable energy. Next slide, Ann. DTE Biomass Energy has been around for about 30 years now, creating renewable energy from waste gas, primarily landfill gas. We're headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we currently operate nearly 30 biogas to energy projects across the United States. Those projects either use biogas as a fuel, where we make electrical power, or we convert the biogas to a product that looks just like natural gas, which then can move through our nation's pipeline transmission system. Next. We've got a fairly meaningful footprint here in the state of North Carolina, and we've got a long-standing relationship with the state. We operate 6 different projects across the state, with one of the largest in our portfolio being here in North Carolina, just outside of Winston-Salem. All of our projects here in North Carolina take biogas generated at landfills and use it as a fuel to drive either an engine or turbine-driven generators to produce renewable green electricity. Next slide. So I thought I would set some high-level context relative to the external environment. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the discussion that has been ongoing in the media and across the United States over the last several years around global warming, reducing greenhouse gases, and generally decarbonizing not only the United States, but the planet as well. Really what this means is reducing those byproducts that result from the combustion of fossil fuels. For example, to make electricity at power plants or to power the vehicles that we drive. And then secondly, to reduce those constituents that are naturally occurring compounds within our environment, such as methane. All of these compounds contain carbon, thus leading to the term that you often hear, decarbonization. The slide I've shown here is simply meant to show the significant amount of tons of carbon dioxide emission equivalents, which must be reduced over the next 20 years in order to stop the rise in global temperatures by just 2 degrees. And what's challenging here is what this slide and the reduction translates to is here in the United States, we'd have to reduce our emissions by about 4.5% per year for the next 20 years. And unfortunately, and what is going to make this as a challenge is that we have only once since the 1990s been able to achieve that level of reduction. Next slide. So achieving carbon reduction emissions of this scale will require significant change to all sectors of the economy, not just on the power generation side. And I think everybody's familiar with that and knows a lot about the wind and the solar and some of the biomass power generation that's talked about and that's done quite a bit of in North Carolina. But we're going to have to do some other things as well. We're going to have to develop new, cleaner burning transportation fuels, for example, electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cells. We're going to have to figure out a way to be more efficient in the energy that we use, both in, for example, heating and cooling our homes and our businesses. And then finally, we're going to have to change some of our industrial processes as well, including, for example, capturing the carbon dioxide that's still emitted into the atmosphere capturing it and then storing it underground as opposed to releasing it into the atmosphere. Slide 6. So what's really cool, I think, about the work that we do at DTE Biomass, so we talked a lot about the carbon dioxide emissions that occur predominantly at power plants and in transportation fuels, but methane is also a very prominent greenhouse gas. And even though there's not as much methane produced here in the United States, it's 23 times more potent than carbon dioxide, which causes us to really want to focus on it and reduce it. And that's, if you look at the two pie chart pieces to the left there, those are the two elements that my company works on to try to concentrate and reduce. Those methane emissions that come from landfills and those through the manure management process. It is interesting to note and I'll point out that bottom teal blue slide that's labeled enteric fermentation. What that actually is methane emissions that comes from the flatulence of animals that's released into the atmosphere, where there's nobody actually doing anything to take care of that and address that. And that's almost roughly the same magnitude of the methane that we're looking to take care of from landfills and from manure management. Next slide. So when organic waste streams like manure, landfills, agricultural waste, food processing waste decompose, biogas, which is predominantly methane, we look to convert that to a beneficial use. So biogas, regardless of the source, is typically composed of about 50% carbon dioxide and 50% methane. And so if uncontrolled, landfill gas or gas from dairy manures can contribute to smog, global warming, and can actually cause health and safety concerns as well. So a lot of questions I often get is, what is a landfill and how is the landfill gas produced? And about 30 years ago, regulations at the federal level mandated and defined what we now refer to as a sanitary landfill. We don't like to call them dumps anymore. And there's three main components of today's modern day landfill. There's a liner, which is pictured here at the lower level and highlighted in orange. And that's the clay and synthetic structure that prevents the rainwater that drains and comes in contact with the trash from leaching and moving into the groundwater. The second system that's very important in a landfill is that leachate removal system. So a lot of water builds up in a landfill structure. It's almost like a big pool, if you will. And in order to maintain the integrity of the landfill structure, you have to pump out and extract that liquid out of that bowl and then take it off site for processing at a wastewater treatment plant where it can then be safely discharged to the environment. And then the third and most important piece for us is the gas collection system. And here what we do is we actually drill about a 3-foot hole into the trash mass, sometimes 60 to 100 feet deep. We then insert a big piece of pipe that's slotted and has holes in it. Once we insert the smaller pipe into that large 3-foot hole, we fill the annular space with stone all the way to the top, and then we cap it. And after we've drilled this series of collection wells, we put a vacuum on those wells and essentially suck that gas that's generated from the decomposition of trash, and then we direct it to a central collection area where we then convert it into a beneficial use. And a couple of those beneficial uses are shown on the next page. So if Ann, you can show those. And so here what we're doing, as I mentioned, for example, in North Carolina, we're taking that gas, and this picture on the right is actually a picture of our power generation facility that we own and operate at the Uwharrie Mountain National Park in North Carolina. And that gas is used as a fuel to power these 6 internal combustion engines, which then produce electricity. And as I mentioned earlier, besides powering internal combustion engines, we can also use them to power turbines, just like that you would find on an airplane, except these are coupled to generators that produce electricity, and we can generate electricity that way and deliver it onto the grid. And so what you're doing here is you're not only destroying the methane that would ordinarily be put into the atmosphere and creating a greenhouse gas, but when we sell this renewable energy to the local utility, they're then able to offset their fossil fuel purchases by less fossil fuel purchase and then reduce emissions that way as well. So on the next slide, we obviously integrate a bit differently when we're at a dairy farm. There are some similarities. The gas looks very much the same. It's roughly 50% carbon dioxide and 50% methane, although manure gas at dairies typically has a higher sulfur compound and content that we have to deal with. We typically partner with very large farms when we install our type of projects, often at farms that have between 5,000 and 9,000 total head of cow at the farm. Today's modern day dairy operations are very modern and are integrated such that every waste stream created as part of the process is beneficially used. Now, without a digester in place, which is very common across the country, the farmer usually puts that manure into a lagoon, and then over time it's land applied as a fertilizer. Well, that's good from a fertilizer perspective, but the problem is that methane that still resides in that lagoon and in that fertilizer releases methane that, as we've talked through this presentation, is very bad for the environment, creates a greenhouse gas, and warms the planet. However, if we're able to come in and install a digester, this manure first can be directed to the digester where biogas is created as that manure decomposes, just like waste decomposes in a landfill. And then what happens is that gas comes out the top, which we can then direct towards a beneficial use. And then you can see the other streams here, the digestate, the liquid portion that comes out of the digester, can now be returned to the farmer and be used again as a fertilizer for his crops. But now that digestate has much less odor and is pathogen, and the pathogens have been reduced as well. So that's very beneficial to the farm. Out the bottom of the digester process, you also get a solid product. That solid product that's also pathogen free. It can be dried and returned to the farm as a bedding to be used for the cows. Next slide. And so just to kind of pull it all together then on this slide, what we're doing then is we're taking the biogas that's generated off of dairy farms and landfill gas, landfills across the country. We're directing it to a processing facility, in which I'll talk about in a second, where we extract the methane component that we actually want. We then produce a product that we call renewable natural gas. It looks just like natural gas that flows in today's pipeline system. And then we transport it actually out to California, where it's used as a vehicle fuel to power CNG and LNG vehicles in California. So if we flip to the next slide, Ann, let's talk a little bit about the equipment that's used to produce that dairy gas. And the first slide here is I've got a cartoon of a digester. So I mentioned before that manure liquid mixture, which is generated continuously 24/7 at a dairy operation, is directed to these large tanks, which we call digesters. These structures can vary in size and design. And the cartoon here that I've showed is one that's referred to as above ground continuous mix digester. There's also digesters that are actually below ground that actually look like underground pools, if you will, where the manure mixture moves in a less continuous fashion. Large mixers are installed inside the digester that keeps the mixture continuously stirred, and heat from outside sources is used typically through heating coils around the exterior of the tank to keep the manure mixture at roughly 100 degrees Fahrenheit to allow the bacteria to form that results in this biogas generation. And the next slide actually shows a picture of two digesters. These happen to be at one of our facilities in Wisconsin. And what you can see there in the background on the right are a picture of two actual above ground digesters. These are roughly 800,000 gallons in size, kind of small as far as digesters go. We've actually got some in Wisconsin that are 1 million gallons, and we're actually looking to build a project in South Dakota next year that will have 4 2 million gallon digesters. These structures here are about 30 feet high and 60 foot wide to give you a sense of what's going on. And then the gas forms and accumulates. The manure typically resides, and these are sized that the manure resides in the digester for about 20 days. And at that point, the manure's been fully digested and all of the gas has been released. And these tops on these digesters are actually floating flexible roof structures where the pressure from the gas generation actually helps keep them inflated. The liquid material is returned to the farm, as I mentioned, to use as a fertilizer. And then you can see in the lower left there that solid material after it's been dried that's now pathogen free can then be used by the farmer for bedding within the farms. The next slide. So now that we've generated the biogas, we need to clean it and convert it to pipeline quality renewable gas so that it can be injected into the pipeline. There's several technologies that can be used to do this. We use what's called membrane system separation to arrive at and separate essentially the methane from the carbon dioxide. Because remember, it's the methane that we actually want to clean up and put into the pipeline. So I've got two pictures here. One is the cartoon at the left that kind of shows a cutaway of what an actual membrane canister looks like. The zoomed in photo on the right shows an actual membrane bundle. And membranes can be described and thought of as a bundle of 1,000 microscopic, very porous straws. And in a single commercial scale cartridge, this fiber length can be as long as 1,000 miles. And so what actually happens is the individual components within the gas, principally the carbon dioxide and methane, have different what's called diffusion rates. So in essence, the methane is directed in one end and it moves through the interior portion of the straw all the way to the end where we collect it and clean it up. The carbon dioxide actually moves and migrates through the axial or the external part of the straw. It's collected with all the other negative constituents and waste products that we're not after. That's collected in a separate stream, and then we direct that to a flare for destruction. And the next page actually shows what one of these membrane systems or membrane plants actually looks like. You can see the membrane canisters there on the lower left, and then the rest of that skid and the rest of the equipment is just simply used to clean and dehydrate and compress the gas up to pressure so that we can sell it. So on the next slide, Ann, so now that we've created the biogas and we've cleaned it into a pipeline quality product, we've now got to get it to market. And unfortunately for us, very often these large commercial farms are in very remote locations across the country and not very near natural gas pipelines. So what we've done at numerous sites is we've employed what's called a virtual pipeline, where we actually truck the renewable gas to one centralized injection facility and then inject it into the pipeline from there. And so what we do is we actually buy, these are very expensive over-the-road liquefied natural gas trailers that cost about $500,000 a piece. They operate at about 3,600 PSI, so very, very high pressure. And so what we do is we fill these trucks up with the renewable gas. The systems are set up so that they'll automatically switch. So if these facilities were to have, one of the trucks were to happen to fill up in the middle of the night, the system would automatically direct the gas over to the second truck. And that next morning, we'd have a driver take the full truck and direct it to our injection facility and then make a round trip back and return the truck back to the farm. And then on my final slide, this is just an overall picture to give you a sense of scale, what one of these overall farm and RNG processing facilities look like. You can see the 4 1 million gallon digesters there in the middle of the picture. The long white roofed structure in the back is actually where the cows are located and milked. And then in the foreground in the lower right, you can see that white building, which is where the actual membranes and the compression and the facility that are used to produce the RNG are stored. And then in front, you've got that flare, and that's where those byproducts and waste products that are generated as part of the process are destroyed. And so that's it, Ann. Tip tutorial on where renewable natural gas comes from and how we make it and where we sell it.
Thank you so much, Mark. Sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself. So I have so many questions, and I want to ask a few. You showed pictures of these very large facilities. How is there an average cost in what goes into building these structures?
Yep, good question, Ann. And it really depends and varies on whether the farmer already has a digester in place. Our early projects, the farmers already had a digester, but on the last picture that I showed, we actually had to come in and build those digesters for the farmer. And that project there that I pictured was in the order of $30 to $35 million. So the investment's fairly significant to put these in place, and quite frankly, why there's not a lot of them in place right now.
Wow. And then when you're seeking partnership with a landfill or a commercial farm, what are you looking for as the optimal landfill or farm?
Yep. So great question again. And so for us, there's really there's three big economic drivers. You've already touched on one of them. How much does it cost to build the facility? The second one is how much can we sell our product for, whether it be renewable natural gas or the electricity. And the third one is how big and how much gas is there available? How large is the resource? So obviously what we're looking at when we're looking at landfills, we're looking at big landfills that have been around a while, that have a lot of trash in place, that are still open and taking in trash, and have gas projection curves that go on for quite some time in the future. Same is true to some extent on dairies, as I mentioned. We're typically partnering and looking at farms that are production level farms that have somewhere north of 5,000 overall head, because again, I did mention, a cow typically will produce about 5 to 6 gallons a day of milk, but the good thing for us is they'll also produce about 40 to 120 pounds per day per cow of manure. And so obviously the more cows, the more manure, the more gas.
Right.
And so that's really the other thing. And so that's why we've really concentrated our efforts on the dairy side across Wisconsin, across South Dakota, across Arizona, across California. Those are the largest milk producing states in the country. And that's where we have focused our early origination efforts.
And then I'm just curious, I know we've only touched on this portion, but how many different types of renewable energy are there?
Wow, there's a ton. I think everybody's familiar with solar. Solar is a big one that gets a lot of attention right now, a lot of attention and a lot of solar installations in the state of North Carolina. The technology costs have really come down in really all the technologies over the last 5 to 10 years. And so solar is a big one. Wind is very prominent across the country. So those two are the largest. And then after that, you start to get into hydroelectric, you start to get into biomass like we talked about today. Woody biomass is another very predominant renewable source, especially out in California, that has a waste wood problem. The wood is taken and essentially combusted to make heat and steam that's used to make electricity as well. But by far, if you were to look at a pie chart of the renewable energy contributors in the United States, it's principally wind and solar.
Gotcha. And then I guess lastly, for people that are watching this, that are just kind of learning about all of this, what would you want their key takeaway to be about renewable energy?
Well, I obviously think there's a lot of good stories, that go along with this. I think greenhouse gas and global warming is a real deal. So I think, supporting it where you can, send your trash to the landfill. I think, organics collection is still very important, and there's a lot of work going on in that space. But I just think, continuing to support those local developers in your area. I think a lot of local utilities have green incentive programs where the customer can pay a little bit more and buy either green electricity or green gas. And what those utilities do then is take that incremental little bit extra fee and they use that either to develop projects themselves or to use that to help subsidize developers like myself to come in and put these projects in place, because as I mentioned, they are very expensive. So I'd ask people to kind of look into where they buy their power, whether it be gas or electricity, and see if there are renewable incentive programs that they can participate in as customers.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark, for this. This was incredibly informative. We are so appreciative of your time, but also appreciative to DTE for being a sponsor to our event this year.
Well, we're glad we're glad we could help out, and good luck in everything with your event this year.
Thank you.